Welcome to the Global Landscapes Forum. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be here. What a beautiful space.
That's incredible. And you have recently celebrated 60 years, not your birthday, but this past Wednesday marked 60 years from when USAID was first created. So congratulations on what a big kind of accomplishment.
Thank you. I've been there for 6 months, but I take full credit for everything they've done over 60 years.
Why not? That's the role. And I think it's a great time to take a step back and look at the progress that has been made in global development, particularly in global health for USAID, but also thinking about where we're at in this moment in time, and thinking about the challenges that are really pressing, especially the climate crisis. And we are entering, I think, the most important decade of the century when it comes to the climate crisis. So we'd love to hear from you. What do you think we have to do differently from what we've done before? And what is USAID's role in driving this transition moving forward?
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you here physically and who are beaming in from all around the world. First, maybe just picking up on a couple of the comments that the minister made. I do think it's worth taking note of this COP and some of the very positive changes that have occurred. My understanding is that there's way more focus on adaptation, way more money now being driven toward adaptation, although maybe we can come back to that, less from the private sector. It's more public sector financing. Now that, of course, is a bad news, good news story that there is more emphasis on adaptation. I mean, part of the reason there's more emphasis is that the consequences of the so-called climate crisis are inescapable now. And so the idea of, for example, USAID just continuing business as usual with our development partners around the world, it's unthinkable. So I think USAID now is a climate agency as well as a development agency. There's just no way to avoid that. So again, these effects of the climate crisis coming home to roost that rightly has gotten people's attention to really try to help people, particularly in developing countries who are the hardest hit, adapt to what we know is already upon them and coming as well. The other dimension of, I think, this year's COP that is at least striking me is, as I heard it put yesterday by the UAE Minister for the Environment, an emphasis, a greater emphasis on soil alongside oil than I think we have seen before. And this panel and this discussion is a reflection of that. Much more emphasis on nature and what nature has to offer, on forestation. Yes, absolutely, an understanding that the reliance on fossil fuel has to come down far more urgently and quickly than it is. But I think that is noteworthy. And then I think you and others have alluded to the elevation of voices that have been excluded, or maybe a better way to put it is the elevation of discussion of voices that have been excluded and that need to be more central. So, and I say that because I think the proof is going to be in the living, right? The proof is going to be in the programming. And we at USAID over many, many years have grown too accustomed to working with, for example, international organizations, international partners. And one of the things that I'm trying to do at the agency with the remarkable team of career professionals that I get to work with every day is shift the emphasis to working with, I know this sounds obvious, but to working with local organizations and local partners. And as part of that, elevating, for example, the voices of indigenous peoples who in this space, dating back hundreds of years, have seen their land taken, their environment soiled and damaged, and haven't even been able to exercise agency or voice in all of that. And if there's to be solutions, this is just a matter of pragmatism as well as justice to bring them more centrally. So again, I think those shifts are afoot. I think we have a very, very long way to go. And you can hear that in the gap between, particularly again, developing countries coming forward and saying what it's going to cost to make the transition to renewables, or what it's going to cost to deal with growing extreme weather events and flooding and drought and wildfire. And we're living those costs even in the United States, but from a much sturdier economic foundation, and yet we see the pain and the hurt of our own people. Imagine that, again, in the most vulnerable parts of the world. So there's still a pretty profound gap between the resources that will be needed to help people, as it were, weather the storm that is upon them, and accelerate those timetables to bring emissions down and where we need to get. But again, much more has been committed this year. Many more private sector actors are seeing that the writing is on the wall, both from the standpoint of their brand, but also their business models. And so that's when the private sector commitment to an issue becomes more reliable, it's when the costs and the benefit calculus shifts. And I think that is what has begun, which I think we can all be encouraged by.
Yeah, I think this is a topic we'll get into a lot more today on supply chains, and just also how the pandemic has really triggered an understanding from the world that we need to prepare, and we can't wait until the last minute to take action. And yes, I think there's the pressure of the responsibility on the private sector and governments to take action. And we did hear some pledges this week as it relates to forests, the Leaders' Declaration on Forests, pledging to reverse deforestation by 2030, which on one hand is wonderful to see everyone rally behind, but also from some of my friends, we look at Target 15.2, which aim to do this by 2020. So we feel clearly behind the ball. So could you tell us what concrete actions that government and private sector can take when it relates to supporting increasing financing for deforestation and for natural climate solutions, so that we can actually get us to where we need to be?
Yeah, I mean, let me maybe just start by sharing some of the details of, I think, a kind of a pretty exciting initiative that was launched by President Biden, the United Kingdom, and Norway back in April, and it's called the LEAF Initiative. And again, the idea here is to lower emissions by accelerating forest financing. And what's unusual about it is that it sort of, even though it's not explicit about it, it kind of recognizes that often you will see the private sector making big announcements when it comes to financing, or banks doing the same, and that's where that announcement comes out in Technicolor, but the small print is to continue to invest in commodity chains that are draining, or that are high emissions, or that are draining of the environment, or fossil fuel actors, and so all of that continues over here as you get the sort of big announcement. So what's unusual about LEAF is it actually holds companies to a higher standard, and there's a lot of scrutiny on the overall paradigm in which the company is structuring its investments. And we already have Amazon, Airbnb, Nestle, McKinsey, Unilever, a few companies, and I think more and more companies are coming on board. But the idea is not that you just get to go and do your financing of reforestation here, or your combating of deforestation here, and then go do these other things. It's a composite look, and with, again, verification at its heart.
Yeah, I think that's important, because we've seen it announced, and I know it's exciting to see private sector actors commit, but there's always that question of accountability, and to see a platform like LEAF actually take an extra step of saying you can't just invest in restoration here and have a business model which is driving degradation.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier young people and your impatience and frustration over all the lost time, which I share, even as not still a young person. But I do think that we can't underestimate the role that young consumers play also in creating that accountability. So in other words, we can create our LEAF initiative, and we governments can come together and get the buy-in of corporate actors, but boy, nothing quite like as more transparency around data, and as the measurement becomes more sophisticated, and we're working on all of that as well at USAID and with other U.S. government actors, including NASA and NOAA, to be able to really see what's happening in terms of forests in real time. But if you combine all of that with you all then making use of that data and, in a sense, holding a mirror up to corporate actors or looking at those companies that aren't part of an initiative like that and saying, where are you? I think that's going to end up fueling this more than, even the top-down commitments that leaders are making this week.
Yeah, I agree. I think this concept of greenwashing, and as a consumer, it's difficult to be conscious, but increasingly more, I think people are understanding how to identify, something that's really vague, like, oh, this is a natural product, or it's vegan, and it's like, what do these things mean? Or it has green packaging, and so it's really important that as we move forward, we kind of interrogate these deeper problems that are that we are somehow contributing to. But I want to kind of come back to what you were mentioning in the beginning on finance's kind of transformative potential in when it's allocated to, in a way that reaches the most marginalized, to local communities and indigenous, peoples who live off of the land and who have such unparalleled knowledge of how to manage these resources. And thinking about them as not as beneficiaries, but as partners. And I think this is something you alluded to a bit. So unfortunately, less than 2% of global climate finance flows today are channeled to small farmers. So I'm curious, how do you see us and USAID as well better partnering with and supporting these stakeholders? There are, I'm sure, many barriers that are in place when it comes to being able to do that. Our systems are not set up to partner at the local level. But how do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, again, this conversation that we're having is necessary, but not at all sufficient to get there. Again, this is a kind of shocking statistic, but USAID's foreign assistance across sectors, not just related to climate, although climate is now touching everything, 5.6% of it goes to local partners.
Wow.
Gasp. 5.6%. So now there's a set of reasons, just as there are for everything, but in this instance, it just turns out that partnering with USAID is really hard.
Yeah.
It requires lawyers and accountants, and the contracts sometimes run, especially big contracts, run hundreds of pages long, and we have all these congressional requirements and these fiduciary responsibilities to our taxpayers, and that has a disparate impact, of course, on indigenous peoples or some plucky but really effective NGO, in a rural area, or some small farmer cooperative that might have a ton to offer and a ton to gain from some catalytic financing. So that disparate impact on smaller local organizations and on those voices is something we have to fight gravity to offset. And so it's just a priority of mine. We're not going to get there quickly. I'm not going to overpromise on this score, but working with our Congress to ensure that there are pools of money that can only be accessed by local organizations, and working at USAID to ensure that our missions, that everybody who works at our missions knows that this is a priority, and therefore, and it's asking a lot for people who are on fumes, given all the effects of the pandemic on the things we care about, but asking them to sit side by side with a local organization and support them, from the standpoint of helping them, sort of get through this onerous contracting process. So it's going to take doing that kind of barrier analysis, understanding why those voices are, in a way, it's like the big debate about unconscious bias. What are actually the things that are impeding us from seeing and lifting up these voices in these communities? But if we don't, there's no solution for the rest of us. So maybe it takes that kind of pragmatic, kind of Darwinian self-interest to need to recognize, indigenous peoples are either controlling or touching 40% of the land that we're talking about here. And so the idea that we can have this conversation and not be hearing, what it is that is, how their livelihoods are affected also by our reforestation plans, who's coming in and trampling their rights in terms of deforestation. So more and more, I think, for us to internalize the nothing about you without you kind of spirit, which is more stated than practiced in development, I think the better.
I think it's refreshing to hear that, and I know for the Global Landscapes Forum community, we've heard this often, where you've got people doing incredible work on the ground, and there's the requirements from a financial standpoint, whether it's the requirements for investors, of development agencies, of even smaller organizations, and it never matches up. And we keep having conversations about it, but it's really inspiring to hear that whether it takes 5 years to get there, that there is a push from USAID to really kind of question how it's been done in the past and to say this isn't working, it's not fit for the future. And I think it would be really nice for us to know. I think and every time you kind of change leadership, there's a chance for change and for transformation, and the same we see in the government in the US. What you really hope to see happen under your time, at the end of the time, coming out of it, to see how USAID has kind of established itself as a climate agency and what outcomes you hope to see.
Well, we talk a lot about international development. The touch phrase of sustainable development, I think, is a very valuable one because it captures all that we're talking about here at COP, and the need to grow the economy in a way that is sustainable from the standpoint of the earth and nature, and not to sort of gobble up the natural resources to fuel your economic development at the expense of future generations. So that is captured by sustainable development. We've also heard this phrase for a long time of inclusive development, and that is really what I am trying to emphasize. I think if you're looking for a kind of chapeau for the conversation we just had about local partners, if you look at also the USAID workforce itself, which I only mentioned because we're at a university, but really trying to change the basically create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce that in my country looks like America, which it doesn't currently, is very underrepresented. But again, recognizing that the perspectives that people of diverse backgrounds bring to development are, by definition, diverse perspectives, and that we all do better when we can move away from groupthink. But even if you take COVID or climate change for that matter, the difference in what we actually do with our assistance when we are, and even to say inclusive is just, it doesn't do it justice in a way, but when we are actually co-designing, when we are in not just a stated spirit of partnership, but when we are actually sitting side by side, we with hopefully some catalytic resources, including from the Development Finance Corporation, from the private sector, as well as our own assistance, and we're sitting side by side and we're staring at the problem set, but we're hearing the perspectives of our partners in the world who are on the front lines, who are feeling the effects, whether of COVID or of climate change or of conflict or of food insecurity, and where their solutions are driving our creativity and our coalition building. I think it's that model for inclusive and sustainable development that I hope we can drive forward.
Thank you. I hate to end the conversation here.
No, please. I'm looking forward to the panels.
Yeah, no, I think just thank you
learn.
For committing this from the outset at the beginning of your leadership and placing these values at the heart of the agency, not because it's easy, but because it just needs to be done.
It is pragmatic. It's a very pragmatic choice if we want the outcomes we seek, given the scale of what communities, particularly vulnerable people, are facing around the world. Better late than never.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and please join me in thanking Administrator Power.
Thanks, everybody.